after many years of research by numerous scholars, including myself, we know now that Sumerian literature consists primarily of epics, myths, hymns, laments.
Hidden in a Philadelphia museum basement, a 91-year-old scholar prepared to take his greatest secret to the grave. Samuel Noah Kramer was the final word on ancient Sumer, yet his last interview contains a warning that could invalidate every history book in your local library. He realized that the ancient wedge-shaped symbols he spent 60 years deciphering were not about myths or legends at all. Instead, they described an awakening that we can no longer even imagine with our modern minds. The crazy part is that the academic establishment did everything they could to make sure you never heard these specific final words. The scholar who knew too much. Samuel Noah Kramer was more than just a historian. For over 60 years, this man did not just study the ancient world, hands down. He was the primary source for everything we thought we knew about the Sumerians. Every single textbook used in schools, and every museum display explaining those strange wedge-shaped marks in clay came from his work. He lived in a Philadelphia basement at the University of Pennsylvania, surrounded by thousands of tablets that were older than the Bible itself. These little pieces of clay were packed with information from over 4,000 years ago, written in a language that had been dead for millennia. Kramer basically taught himself how to read this lost language. When he started his career in the 1920s, there were no dictionaries or teachers to help him. He had to compare thousands of texts, looking for patterns like a master codebreaker. By the time he published his famous book, History Begins at Sumer, in 1956, he had introduced the world to the first love songs, the first schools, and the first legal codes. He was the bridge between our modern world and the very beginning of human society. People looked at him as the final word on the subject because he had seen things no other human had seen in 5,000 years. But here is the catch. While the world was celebrating his brilliance, Kramer was starting to feel a deep sense of unease. He was sitting in that basement, smelling the clay dust and sensing that something was fundamentally off. He had spent his life putting ancient thoughts into modern boxes, and he began to wonder if those boxes were actually cages. He was the man who owned Sumer, but as he got older, he started to realize that the ancient people were speaking a language he might not truly understand. He had the words right, but the meaning was slipping through his fingers like dry sand. It is not that simple, though, because the academic world was not ready for a man like Kramer to start doubting himself. He was the authority, and his word was gospel. If he was wrong, then everyone else was wrong too. He kept his deepest fears in the footnotes of his papers for a long time, hoping someone would notice. The crazy part is that almost nobody did. They were too busy using his translations to build their own careers. They didn't see the haunted look in his eyes when he talked about the silence of the tablets. What most people do not realize is that Kramer was not just translating stories. He was trying to translate a completely different way of existing. He spent his days in a room that felt like a tomb, surrounded by the voices of the dead. He was 91 years old and only weeks away from the end when he finally decided to speak the truth on camera. He knew that if he did not say it now, the real story of humanity would be lost forever. He leaned into the lens and told the world that we had gotten the entire framework of history wrong. Everyone is obsessed with the details of the past, but Kramer was looking at the big picture. He realized that our modern minds might be incapable of truly hearing what the Sumerians were trying to say. We look at their tablets and see religion and government, but they might have been describing something else entirely. He was ready to tear down the very house he had spent 60 years building. The basement was cold, but the secrets Kramer was about to reveal were even colder. Cracks in the foundation. The trouble started quietly in the footnotes of Kramer's most famous academic papers. For years, he had been dropping hints that certain Sumerian concepts were impossible to translate into English. He would write that a particular word had no exact equivalent, or that a passage remained obscure. To a normal reader, this just seemed like a careful scientist being honest about his work. Yeah, about that, it was actually a cry for help. Kramer was realizing that the Sumerian language did not even have a word for religion. In our modern world, we separate the spiritual from the physical. We have churches and we have laboratories. For starters, the Sumerians did not see the world that way at all. They had no concept of a miracle because they did not have a baseline for what was normal. To them, everything was part of the same great power. When Kramer translated the word for God, he realized it actually meant something closer to a cosmic principle. These were not beings sitting on clouds. They were forces of nature and consciousness. By the 1980s, Kramer was writing that the more he studied these texts, the less certain he became. He told people that he was no longer convinced the Sumerians had the same concept of a world that we do. Imagine spending 50 years as the world's top expert only to realize you have been using the wrong definitions for everything. His colleagues at universities like Yale and Chicago started to whisper that he was losing his mind. They thought he had spent too much time alone with the dust and the clay. So, here is the deal. Kramer wasn't losing his mind, he was finding it. He was starting to see that the Sumerians didn't worship their gods the way we think. They didn't see them as external masters, but as states of being. When he looked at a tablet describing the creation of humans, he began to see something else. He saw a description of an awakening, not a physical manufacturing process. This shifted the entire meaning of human history from a story of being created to a story of waking up. The Sumerians used a mathematical system based on 60, which seems totally random to us. We use 10 because we have 10 fingers, but 60 is divisible by so many more numbers. It is mathematically elegant in a way our system can't touch. Kramer started to wonder if this math wasn't just a choice. What if it was a reflection of how they actually perceived the world? What if their brains were wired to see patterns that we are now completely blind to? And that is putting it lightly. Kramer was suggesting that the ancient people had a level of precision in their astronomy that we didn't rediscover until the Renaissance. They tracked stars and planets for thousands of years with insane accuracy. Most experts said they were just patient observers. But Kramer had a different theory. He thought they might have been perceiving these patterns directly, without needing the complex tools we rely on today. He was looking for a key to a door that had been locked for 5 millennia. Awakening of the clay. Everything came to a head with one single tablet from the ancient city of Nippur. It was a piece of clay dated to around 2,100 years before the Common Era. Kramer had actually translated this specific tablet 40 years earlier, in 1949. Back then, he thought it was a simple dialogue between a human and a god about the origins of civilization. It fit the standard story perfectly. The gods gave humans the gift of knowledge, and civilization began. Case closed, or so he thought. But for 40 years, that tablet nagged at him like a splinter in his mind. In 1988, at 91 years old, he sat down to look at it one last time. He tried to forget everything he had ever written about it. He stared at the marks for 3 hours, letting the dust settle on his shaking hands. His assistant watched him, worried that the old man was having a medical emergency. Kramer didn't move for 3 minutes, his face turning pale as he stared at the clay. When he finally spoke, his voice was a haunted whisper. He realized that the word he had translated as gift actually meant awakening. The word he thought meant human actually meant the sleeping one. The word for God was actually the fully aware power. Basically, the tablet wasn't saying that external beings handed over technology to primitive people. It was saying that civilization started when humans suddenly woke up to abilities they already had inside them. This wasn't just a small correction. It was a total disaster for the academic world. If Kramer was right, every book he had ever written was wrong. Every dissertation his students had finished was based on a lie. He showed his new notes to other experts, and the reaction was pure terror. One colleague at Yale reportedly went white and told Kramer that this would invalidate his entire career. They didn't want the truth. They wanted to keep the framework they were comfortable with. Kramer realized that he had spent his life imposing modern ideas onto an ancient reality. He had made the Sumerians look like us because it was the only thing that made sense to a 20th century mind. But the Sumerians weren't like us at all. They were something else. They lived in a world where the mind and the stars were connected in a way we can't even dream of today. The tablet was a map to a lost state of consciousness, and Kramer had been reading it like a grocery list. The crazy part is that this awakening seemed to happen almost overnight in the historical record. Irrigation, urban planning, and metallurgy all appeared out of nowhere around 4,500 years before the Common Era. The standard view says they just got lucky or worked hard. Kramer's new view was that a sudden shift in human awareness made these things immediately obvious. It was like a light switch being flipped on for the entire species. But every light that is turned on can also be turned off. Consciousness event. The most terrifying part of Kramer's confession was his theory on why Sumer actually collapsed. Most historians say they were conquered by enemies, or that their soil became too salty for farming. That is the normal stuff we hear in documentaries. But Kramer noticed something strange in the tablets from the final centuries of Sumer. The way they wrote started to change. The quality of thought in the later texts was different. It was more concrete and much less concerned with the big cosmic ideas. It was like the civilization was losing its mind long before it lost its territory. Kramer believed that the special mode of consciousness that made Sumer possible was slowly fading away. The people were becoming more like us, practical, limited, and disconnected from the deeper patterns of reality. By the end, the Sumerians were writing like people who no longer understood what their own grandfathers had written. They were looking at the same tablets we see today and feeling the same confusion. He pointed to the famous Sumerian king list as proof of this decline. The early kings were said to have reigned for tens of thousands of years. Standard history says this is just mythology and that the ancient people were exaggerating. But Kramer had a wilder idea. What if those numbers represented a different experience of time? What if the sleeping ones perceived a single year the way we perceive a decade? As their consciousness collapsed, their lifespans in the records began to look normal. Kramer felt that we are the descendants of that collapse. We are living in the aftermath of a massive cognitive event that erased our best abilities. We look at a ziggurat and see a pile of bricks. But the early Sumerians might have seen a machine for the mind. We are on the other side of a great divide, trying to read a map while we are totally blind. In his final interview, he leaned toward the camera with wet eyes and said that Sumer didn't fall because of war. It fell because the people changed. The academic establishment did not want to hear that we are a diminished version of our ancestors. We like to think we are at the top of the mountain. We have smartphones and space travel, so we assume we are the smartest humans to ever live. But Kramer was suggesting that we have lost something precious that we don't even have a name for anymore. He saw history as a record of things being forgotten, not just things being learned. He was a man who had seen the beginning of the world and was now watching the end of his own. Do you think we have lost a special power our ancestors once had? Or was the top expert in the world just confused in his old age? Drop your theory in the comments and let us know what you think about this lost consciousness. If you want more forbidden history that the experts are trying to hide, make sure to like and subscribe for more.